with that, I am going to call tonight's debate to order on Resolved, America is a Racist Nation. And with that, I'm looking for a speech in the affirmative. Mr. Phillips, go ahead. So panelists, you're allowed to raise your physical hand, and Luke, go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I just want to start by saying that I'm using this speech tonight to make an appeal to my fellow conservatives, in that I think it's important that we take race a lot more seriously and a lot more deeply than sometimes we can justly be accused of being. I guess I might be using maybe a looser term, a looser definition of racism than is sometimes used. I think when the term is thrown around willy-nilly a lot, it can just halt conversations without starting anything good. But maybe the seriousness of it kind of hints at the seriousness of the question of race as well, and why we should take a deeper look at it. So fundamentally, I think colorblindness is incredibly insufficient as a way of thinking about race and race in America and race in the human experience and race as all of us experience it. I don't think race is everything, but I do think that in general, it's one of the most important things for our identities and how we view ourselves in the world and how we interact in the world, not at an absolute level, but in a way that quietly can't be escaped. And over the course of American history, it has played a bigger role, I think, than even many of those who make a big deal out of it will tend to make it to. It's not just in the legacy of America's dismal treatment of African Americans and Native Americans and other nowadays assumed to be minority ethnic groups. It's also woven into the history of relations among different kinds of American white people. One of the hidden kind of truths in American history understanding is that that any American majority that you have, be it a racial, ethnic, religious, regional, class majority, is really just a coalition and a compromised kind of a temporary thing based on a hugely diverse array of groups. And if you look at the development of what we now call whiteness in America, you realize that the vast majority of the groups that are now under the banner of whiteness are groups that at many times in the history of America beforehand were not looked upon as white. So the notion that there is a kind of 100% Americanism that has like some connectedness to white values has always been a contingent thing that has even been something that has taken a lot of divides within different American ethnic and regional and religious communities to get to. And the process of creating those majorities or those coalitions has never been a process of merely coming to agreements. It's been processes of discrimination and violence a lot of the time, as my Hungarian ancestors discovered in the aftermath of the First World War, and as many white ethnics across American history have, and as members of every minority group compared to the general mainstream has as well. And so the thing that I just want to make eminently clear is that this plurality of experiences has never been anything you can consider to be colorblind. This irreducible complexity of American divides has made for some of the very processes of American politics itself. And this, of course, has been a fodder for the elites at any given time in American history, Southern planters, New England WASPs, to divide and conquer Americans of diverse and fractious groups against each other. But it has also been one of the single greatest sources of our redemption. It has also been one of the ways by which Americans of every generation, of every national background, have been able to become 100% Americans, have been able to become full members of the national community over time, over the generations, not merely by glorious military service or living the American dream, but by participating in the give and take process of American public life and social life itself. Sometimes it's taken longer than others, but every group of Americans of any race and ethnic background through this kind of process has over time been here. And I think it does a disservice to the depth of those experiences, to the depths of discrimination that they face to argue that racism has not been the central narrative in it, that racism has not been one of the major things that has had to be overcome. And so in conclusion, I think that the reality of race in American life and the reality that so much of American life has been racist in so many different directions that that are hard to fathom nowadays has been not only something that we should recall, but it has something that is in some way a way that the American people can redeem themselves over time as we address these problems. And given the reality of human nature, we probably will be addressing them for quite some time. But it's something that we shouldn't avoid. We shouldn't just say color blindness is the answer. We should hit it straight where it is and work on it over time. So thank you, Madam Chair, for the time here.
All right, jazz hands for our brave first speaker. Excellent, yes. This group is willing to use jazz hands. I like that. A lot of groups were like, come on, Congressman, come on, let me see your jazz hands. But y'all are just like on top of it. Thank you. So we're going to take, so just to remind everybody, we'll be taking 3 questions. The first one will be from a panelist. So panelists start thinking. And the other 2 will be from 2 attendees. Their names are Beverly Cheney and Kitty Monroe. So Beverly and Kitty, get ready to ask your questions, and you can look in the chat if you need a reminder for what they are. So we're going to start with a panelist question. Is there a panelist who has a question for Mr. Phillips? If so, you can raise your real physical hand, not your Zoom hand, and I'll call on you. Mr. Watson, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm curious, is why is color blindness considered to be a thing that is negative to recognizing and grappling with the very real histories and realities in the American experiment? Why isn't that not seen as an accentuation, an enhancement of an ability to be able to do that?
Great. Mr. Phillips?
In my opinion, color blindness can be and has been useful in a lot of ways about how individuals treat each other and should treat each other. And it's also important for questions of the law and questions of equal treatment before the law. I think in terms of understanding the things that make us all tick, I think in terms of culture, I think in terms of the communities we feel most at home in, color blindness has the tendency to argue that the things that make us special and the things that make our community's historical experiences unique and powerful and passionate, I think colorblindness can do a disservice to those in ways that is more harmful than we always think. And to just give a straightforward example, I think there's a way in which kind of modern mainstream secular liberal culture is a kind of colorblindness in itself, right? And the experiences of, for example, the Filipino-American Catholic community, of which I'm also a part, my mother is from the Philippines, cannot really be dissolved into the values of modern secular liberalism in all ways. I don't think there's necessarily a hostility between them. I just think there's a way in which being proactive and positive about one's ethnic background is as useful or more useful a way to engage in thinking about identity. So.
All right, excellent. Next question will be from Beverly Cheney. Ms. Cheney, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Good evening, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
My question is, what does it mean for a nation to be racist?
Great. Mr. Phillips.
I think it can mean a lot of things. I think what I mean specifically by this is that racism and racist attitudes and racist institutions are baked into a lot of the historical heritage of the nation itself. And I think in America, that's undeniable, just looking at various things. I live in the past in some ways. And so I think it's, the more I just look at these things, that's it. I don't think that that means that a nation is only racist. I don't think that that means that that racism defines a nation beyond everything else. I just think it's a part of it. A part of the human evil inherent to human nature and human society, its aggregate, that is that should not be denied lest it grow worse than it was before.
All right, very good. I am seeing some questions show up in the Q&A box. I'll remind folks that we're not actually using the Q&A box, we're using a Google form. And so if a whip would stick that link again in in the chat box, that would be great, just because I can see that there are folks who want to ask questions and need the right link for how to do that. And for a final question, Kitty Monroe. Ms. Monroe, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you. My question is, if a significant portion of whites are unable to accept as real that Blacks have been and continue to be treated as second-class citizens in the U.S., how can we then meet in the middle to improve how Blacks and other non-whites are treated and accepted?
Well, again, I think this is the reason it's important to take race seriously, right? And frankly, I mean, for what it's worth, I don't know that I have a good answer for the ways to convince people of things, right? I think we can only come out of our own experiences and try to empathize with others as best we can. But I think the process of discourse is important for the process of redemption, and here is to hoping that over the next century of American life, we can come a little bit closer to it. So.
All right, and with that, Mr. Phillips is thanked. One more round of jazz hands for our first affirmative. Thank you so much. So I am now looking for a speech in the negative. I believe so panelists, I would love it if you would go ahead and raise your hand when it's your turn, just so everybody can see it. But the next up is, yes, Professor Reilly, go for it. You have 5 minutes.
Right. Start this. All right, so I'm a quantitative political scientist. I'm a professor at Kentucky State, and I'm the author of the books Hate Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. And I'm taking the negative position, with some ambiguity, but the negative position as America being a racist nation. And my starting point here is that words mean things. A lot of this debate is a semantic one. So there obviously are plenty of racists in America. But when we talk about institutional racism or a racist country, the logical take from my discipline would be that we have to be talking about a society where racial discrimination is encouraged, a la pre-1964 South Africa, or at least legal, or at least where there's more of it than in most other places. And the modern USA doesn't really fit any of those bills. Obviously, there are plenty of individual racists in America. And I think it's important for people on the center and right politically to acknowledge that. A major study from Pew recently showed that around 8% of all Americans wouldn't vote for a qualified Black man from their own political party for president. That's shameful. The same study found 9% rates of bias against Hispanics and Jews, by the way. We POC, quote unquote, don't do much better when we're asked how we feel about whites. So lots of people are bigots because lots of people are jerks and jackasses. But again, that's not what a term like an institutionally racist nation means. If you look at actual American history and law, we fought a major and unprecedented war to end legal slavery in 1865. We banned legal segregation in 1954. Far too late, of course, but that is done. We made all racial discrimination illegal via the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Pro-minority affirmative action has been the law since the Philadelphia Plan in 1967. It's something that as a boss and as a higher ed executive, I've encountered hundreds, if not thousands of times. So these are all just undisputed facts. And in the post-1954 modern era, we've become the most successful multiracial democracy in the history of the world. And in that light, it's worth very quickly looking at and unpacking some of the claims today of systemic, more sophisticated racism. So the basic systemic racism argument is that even if racism is formally illegal, we can tell it exists widely because there are gaps in performance between groups. For example, whites earn more than Blacks and we earn more than Latinos. So scholars like Ibram Kendi will very openly say that progress is a facade. The only two possible explanations for this are genetic inferiority, which almost no one believes in, and hidden constant racism. But that's simply not accurate. Giant groups that vary in terms of something as important or at least as noticeable as ethnicity also vary in terms of dozens of other, what you could call cultural characteristics. For example, the most common age for a Black man is 27, while the most common age for a white man is 58. Black people are 2 to 3 times more likely to live in the South, where wages are lower for everyone. And as people like Thomas Sowell and June O'Neill have pointed out, Adjusting for literally just 3 or 4 things like this stuff and any test score close most of the Black and white and Asian gaps in the USA. And it's worth noting that today, Asians usually beat whites. So do Nigerians and Indians. If you just go to Britannica or Wikipedia and look up highest earning income groups, you'll see that 8 of the top 10 in the USA today are people of color, including Indians, South Africans from the motherland, Filipinos. So this doesn't mean that we shouldn't work to close those residual gaps, like that wealth gap between specifically Blacks and whites. It doesn't mean we shouldn't fight awful police brutality. But it's hard to see a country where racism is illegal and most of the wealthiest groups are minorities as a white supremacist hellhole. And very quickly, last thing, as a political scientist, I have to say there's another measure we use here. There's a source, World Population Review, that ranks the world's nations in terms of racism. They anonymously ask thousands of people, and each of them things like whether they'd be willing to have a neighbor of a different race or religion. In 2021, we were tied with Brazil and the UK as the least racist countries in the world. Also shout to Guatemala and New Zealand, who did almost as well. The most racist countries were India and Palestine, Israel, if I recall correctly. So the USA isn't heaven or utopia. We'd lose every race if we were competing against those places, but we're doing pretty well against Earth. That's my take.
All right, very good. Jazz hands for our first negative speaker. Yeah. You can jazz hand yourself. I love it. We've not had anybody do that, but we should start. You started a trend, I think. All right. So as usual, we're going to start with a panelist question. And our first attendee question, just so you can get ready, will be Jose Urena. And excellent. I just want to remind you panelists to raise your physical hand. I'm guessing, yeah, Russell, Mr. Ballew, go ahead. Ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, that was a very rousing address in the negative. The professor did great. The question I'd ask is, he said that there are several racist individuals. What do you propose we do to help those individuals become better?
Madam Chair, I also respond to the chair. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Madam Chair, in response to the question just presented, first, I think this is something we can all agree on. I mean, when I just said, 10% of whites and POC test as racist, there is a tendency, I think, on the US right to deny that bigotry exists at all, which is silly. A bunch of people are bigots. This is one of the great human vices. What do we do about it? That's a question they've been asking since ancient Rome. It's one of the key questions in diverse societies. I think that we have a pretty good starting point right now where most forms of racial discrimination are illegal and racism is socially not tolerated. I also think that when you see someone make a bigoted comment, we don't need to become the PC police, get hypersensitive here, but traditional racial comments or anything approaching that, I mean, jump in, intervene, don't let that be tolerated. Beyond that, I'm not sure you can do too much about what lurks inside someone's head. A lot of people in life, for a bunch of reasons, mostly stupid, aren't going to like you. I think what we can do is prevent them from publicly expressing that as much.
Excellent. Go ahead. So yes, very good. So for our first attendee question, we'll go with Jose Urena. Mr. Urena, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you for the opportunity. My question is, do we confuse the word race, as you mentioned, I'm sorry, Madam
As
Chair,
he mentions.
As it was mentioned that words are important. And sometimes I think we use race instead of subculture. Like I'm a Dominican mulatto from New York. My experience is totally different, but I'm called a person of color. So sometimes I wonder if we are misusing the word race, meaning subculture. Thank you.
Great. Professor Reilly, go ahead.
Yeah, Madam Chair, in response to that question, I think the answer is clearly yes. This gets into a long, complicated debate about whether race exists at all, and if so, what it means. I do think that the genetic categories from a site like 23andMe have some value, but they overlap very little with our racial categories. So for example, I identify as a Black man. Just looking at me, it's very obvious that I also have that Celtic and Native American side of my heritage. I'm about 40–45% Black, I would suppose. So very often when we talk about race, we're not talking about anything. Hispanic would be a good example of this. I mean, you're essentially putting Black Cubans and Dominicans, I mean, that would be my opinion of most of the members of those populations I've seen, Mestizo or Indio Mexicans, and then Spanish Colombians in the same category. One very quick last line, actually, this is a problem not just for the social justice left, it's probably an end game problem for the racist alt-right. I mean, in that you have people say things like, well, what reason other than genetics would there be for Hispanics and people of Arabic descent underperforming whites? And you kind of have that moment where you explain all those groups are Caucasian. We've just put them in different categories. So what this means other than what we socially define it as meaning, again, that's an ambiguous question. Ethnicity is what we say in political science. People fight across ethnic lines.
All right, and for our final attendee question, we'll go to Robin Brands, and go ahead and ask your question to me. So, Madam Chair, please.
First, yes, thank you, and thank you for all the panelists and people bringing this debate to life. And Madam Chair, my question is, since clearly you made a strong argument.
Since the speaker doesn't believe, made an argument.
Doesn't believe, sorry, that the country is a racist nation, but there are racist citizens. Does the speaker believe that there are wealth and health gaps as examples remaining from historical racial practices, policy, and laws that need to be dealt with?
All right, very good.
Madam Chair, I think that the very short answer to this would be yes, sometimes, and I'll try to keep this in 30 seconds, something like that. But obviously, life is complex. One of the things that a lot of people in right-leaning political science and economics, Tom Sowell, June O'Neill, so on, have pointed out, is that different groups are indeed different. We differ in terms of age, region, study culture, so on. When you adjust for those things, most gaps close substantially. There's not a wealth gap between, say, Asians or recent Black immigrants and whites. Both those groups are dramatically outperforming whites, to be blunt. Do I think that one of the things that caused some of those cultural differences in Black, and I'd say more broadly Southern communities, I live in Appalachia, is past conflict? Yeah. To me, the best solution to the fact that we have a very diverse lower class due to past oppression is to help the poor. Quite frankly, I don't have a problem with things that would boost people up, give people a chance. But again, don't forget that 49% or whatever of the people in that situation are white. They're Caucasian people living in states like Kentucky.
Right, and with that, Professor Reilly is thanked. Jazz hands.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, there we go. All right. Excellent. So we are now going to move to a speech in the affirmative. And so go ahead and let's go ahead and go with Mr. Ballew. You have 5 minutes. You're muted. Thank you for being the first one to do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am not a professor. I am a layperson, so we will speak from that perspective to foster, as you said, understanding. On May 30th, 1778, the philosopher François-Marie Arouet died. He died, but he left the world a vision. Better known as Voltaire, he was one of the most influential architects of what we today would call the American dream. He was one of the revolutionary catalysts whose ideals inspired Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and other early American patriots to revolt and to rear a republic for and by the people. In his masterpiece, Candide, Voltaire exalts the individual pursuit of gain as the purpose of life, the pursuit of gain, and the pivot around which a society should revolve. In many ways, America that we see today realizes his quintessential notion. He called it Il fait cultiver notre jardin. We must each make our own gardens. America, after all, is a place where anyone can make it and have their house on a hill. This vision has propelled people to our shores for over 245 years. After all, what could possibly be better to a peasant or a serf than moving to a place where you can own your own way? Well, how about owning the human resources that make your way possible? Imagine coming to a country constituted to enable you to own those that make your way so. What made America so compelling was not just the opportunity to live the dream of owning your own, but coming to a space with structures in place and strictures in action that enabled the best advantage ever: access to the fruits of other individuals' efforts. So why don't I have a house on a hill, right and for real? Green grass, tight and tidy, full belly, vegan deal, instead of stone box and blocks with thugs and rats, dreaming of my Audi, Persian rugs and cats. Missing, right with it, opportunities, hopes get slain. But not me. I'm a mind replete with gems, shining, grinding, co-hitting them stems, persevering through pain, mind, body, and soul. Virtue's my ladder out of this hole. Kaizen. Kaizen, kicking little by little, early to rise, picking improvement, healthy, wealthy, and wise. This is a verse an African-American may say to himself, exhorting virtue to bring good things to his life. So on February 23rd, 2020, I take a run down my block. Only 25, I'm on the path. When a father and son gun me down in our small Georgia town, a nightmare where virtues become vice grips, helpfulness, kindness, decency, hard work extinguished. 2 weeks ago, a police officer, his chief rewards his punctuality and responsibility with a KKK emblem, reminding the victim of the constraints the virtuous suffer being bound back in America. Bound back. What binds American virtue back? Shara Argawal says it best. She says, you know, there are no Black people in Africa. There are no Black people in Africa. However, in America, too often and in too many places and spaces, we hold to races. America brands us Black. They brand us Black for the love of money. This is what we mean when we say America is racist. The nightmare we experience ends when we realize that our all-consuming love of things is ripping us apart. Daylight breaks when we learn to replace selfish, the insistent self, in service to other people and higher purpose. The purely materialistic ideology animating Voltaire's vision, the land of milk and honey, must be ennobled by divine ideals like e pluribus unum, out of many one. Baha'u'llah's words, his vision, we are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch, inspire a unifying notion, a notion that pulls us from the isles of cruel isolation to the continents of love, unity, and the cooperative pursuit of happiness. Perhaps it's time to make the divine prime and sublime our better angels.
All right. I didn't know that we had recruited a poet. My goodness. Okay, well, with that, I'm looking for, again, first a question from the panelists, and then our first attendee question will be Kelly Way. And Mr. Watson, go for it. Ask your question to me.
Well, Madam Chair, the previous speaker made mention of American virtue, and I just wanted to ask, how does American virtue differ from private or individual virtue, and what is the significance of American virtue to understanding race?
You know, Madam Chair, I appreciate the question. The practical issue for many African Americans is that they pour their virtue, like all others, into things, right? Hoping that they can get ahead. And in the stories that I share, we see that taken from them. And really, I'm going to agree that historically it was much worse. But even in this day, you have those instances where people pour out their excellence in patents or other things that they have created, and they don't get their fair share because of the ongoing residual effects of racism. This is my response.
All right. And for our first, our first attendee question will be Kelly Way. Second will be Scott O'Leary. Kelly, or Ms. Way, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question to me. Okay.
Kelly's fine. Thank you, Madam Chair. I sent two questions. I'm looking for which question we're fielding here. Is it the one about
Yes.
immigration?
Yes.
Okay. First off, Mr. Ballew, thank you for your incredible, eloquent spoken word. Very poetic. Years ago, I tutored an immigrant from Congo, Mzimakwele, who came to the United States with his family about 4 years ago. And there's literally thousands like him over the past just handful of years that are literally banging down the doors to come to the United States. Him and his family had to wait 9 months in a refugee camp to be able to literally leave their life behind to come here. So what is systemically embedded in our culture that is racist, that is not obvious to immigrants like him, that they're still wanting to come to the United States?
So, Madam Chair, that's an excellent question. And the difference is what one of my good friends has called post-traumatic slave syndrome. You know, when a person experiences a trauma, right, it leaves an imprint. And that makes it very difficult for that person. You know, we know that the studies called Pavlov's dog, right? We all have heard of that. And so the dog is abused, and then after a time, the abuse goes away, and the stimulus is tried to get the dog to go and move forward, and the dog does not because it remembers its pain. One of the things that we have to realize is that the wounds left by slavery are slow healing and grievous, right? And not only does the person who's gone through it experience, but they are passed down epigenetically to their children. So God bless the individual who comes here without that background, without that baggage. It doesn't burden them. It's not surprising to see that Nigerians and other folks from Africa come to America and excel in ways that those who have been here and have not had this epigenetic nightmare haunting them, they do better. This is my answer based upon the science of it.
All right. And for our final question, Mr. O'Leary, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a question first for Mr. Ballew, but actually applies to all the panelists. And I would like to know whether all of you believe that whether racism is an asymmetrical concept. And what I mean by that is, in other words, can only certain groups be racist due to structural imbalances of power, or can any one person or group be racist based on some other criteria or definitions of racism?
Great, thank you. Mr. Ballew?
So there are two answers. The first answer is that they are a-changing. In the story that I shared, a Black police officer comes to his desk to work. His white police chief puts the KKK emblem in, and so he's hounded. His supervisor, the police chief's supervisor, the mayor, fires him. So one of the things that I would have to agree with is that the world is changing. This is something that our previous speaker said. But the first speaker said something that was interesting. And this speaks to the insidious and enduring nature of racism. If I pose you a question, and the question is this: who was our first Black president? It's a rhetorical question. So to move the conversation, many of you are thinking of Barack Obama. But if you think about it, actually, the man's not Black. He's a beautiful coffee color, right? My hair is Black. That man is coffee colored. But technically, he's also not Black. His mother was white. But in America, we call him Black because of this history, this enduring, cruelly enforced notion, right, of one drop of blood. There's one drop of blood to protect property rights. In the South, you are Black. These things are shadows that we're still struggling with. So when I don't, to answer your question directly, it's not necessarily asymmetric. I think the first speaker said it well, Madam Chair, when he said each group of people brings certain experiences that are robust and deep. And so we have to acknowledge that history. But and so that's part of what we're working with. The institutions may have moved, but people are still grappling with that specter in their own hearts and minds. That's what I think we're dealing with more than anything else. Thank you for those questions.
All right, and with that, the speaker is thanked. Yes, one more round of jazz hands, absolutely. And you can jazz hand yourself if you want to, Mr. Ballew. I don't know if that's a thing you do, but anyway, excellent. Okay, so we will now look for a speech in the negative. Mr. Saltwick, you have 5 minutes, go ahead.
Madam Chair, I speak in opposition to the resolution. But first, I address those that speak in support. If they support this resolution in order to help the country they love, then we have common ground, because we both want to see the situation in our country improve, and that's what love of country is all about. I grew up in the Jim Crow South when America was a racist country. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee in the 50s and 60s. Our maid, a wonderful Black woman named Dorothy, would take my brother and me downtown on a bus to see the movies. We sat in the front of the bus, she in the back. At the movies, we sat on the main floor. She sat in the balcony. We had the same doctor, and we entered through the front door, she in the back. And not only was this the way things were done, there were laws to that effect. When a Black family moved onto our block, their neighbors, my parents' best friend, could not tolerate living next to a Black family. They spent their life savings moving to the most exclusive neighborhood in Memphis. But God has a sense of humor for who moved in next door, but the Black drummer for Booker T and the MGs. There were parties all night and they couldn't move. Karma is real. I was a teenager sacking groceries when MLK was shot. I remember that night. I had heard him speak the day before. That night, I knew things could not change, it could not stay the same. And I joined many others on a journey of change, of laws, of attitudes that bring us today. When I tell my children about such things, they look at me with the same kind of eyes they had when I showed them how to play a vinyl record on a turntable. Sheer disbelief that things work that way. The country has changed greatly. My kids' attitudes are only one proof point that the country is not a racist country anymore. Perhaps no better proof point comes from former President Barack Obama. In a speech about Jeremiah Wright's words damning America, and I quote, "They expressed a profoundly distorted view of this country, a view that sees white racism as endemic and that elevates what is wrong with America above all we know that is right with America. The profound mistake of Reverend Wright's sermons was not that he spoke about racism in society. It's that he spoke as if our society was static, as if no progress has been made. Progress, which I see every day, is what underpins my firm belief that America is not a racist country today." Madam Chair, while I oppose the resolution, I also acknowledge a truth within it. Racism is still present in this country and in every country in the world. As a former neuroscientist, I can attest that stereotypes and us-them perspectives are wired into our brain. They are not going to disappear with simplistic training, but they can be overridden with skills from impactful experiences like those from Braver Angels and others. We must also talk about addressing the lingering impact of racism that I saw in my youth. But we must be wary of assertions that discrimination is always the source of disparate impact. This fallacy pervades far too many racial discussions. Sometimes it's true, as in redlining, but often it's not. I urge our viewers to read Thomas Sowell on this point. Disparities between groups are the norm in nature and not prima facie evidence of external wrongdoing. This point demands far more discussion than I have time to give it, so I hope we explore it further tonight and beyond. I am a proud conservative, but I join Presidents Obama and Clinton when I say there is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured with what is right with America. There will always be more work to be done. Human beings are not perfect and never will be, but I have an unshakable belief that as people of diverse backgrounds engage in good faith, we will continue to forge common ground that moves us forward so that we can keep the republic we so dearly love. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, jazz hands for one of our field leaders, Mr. Saltwick. Yes, very good. So we will, as usual, be starting with a panelist question. And then for our first field question, we will go to Randy Lieberman. But first, any questions from the panel? Ms. Guzman, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
All right, Madam Chair, I would like to ask the speaker how much he thinks that his perspective, having lived through such an enormous change in daily life in the treatment of sort of the gap in the treatment between white and Black, how much that informs his perspective versus, you know, so many folks who are younger who didn't grow up in the South, et cetera. I want to hear more about that.
All right.
Well, I mean, Madam Speaker, I would hold that, you know, we are what we are. We are our lived experience together with our heritage and culture and things like that. I mean, I grew up with what I grew up in, and what I would say, what strikes me, and the story about the vinyl turntable is big, because I don't know about your kids. When my kids saw a turntable, I mean, they just couldn't believe it. I mean, it was just like, you got to be kidding. And that's the level, that's what I see today. I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Tennessee, I've lived in Silicon Valley, I've lived in England for a while and all that. And the society we live in today is vastly different than the society I grew up in, right? I mean, and you cannot, in my opinion, call America racist as a country because of that. But as Wilfred talked about, and others of our speakers, there are clearly racist, I'm a conservative, and there's clearly racist in the society as we exist. But I would hold that the majority, and there was a question about what to do about it, I would hold that your brain can only handle about 100 social interactions, right? And outside that circle, you are dealing in stereotypes, right? The best way to break through a stereotype is to learn about someone as a person. And that is one of the experiences of Braver Angels. It's one of the experiences of many other things, right? And I have found that as people get to know people, and there's more capabilities for that these days, there's less stereotypes, you know, and we begin to treat each other as unique individuals with our history and race and ethnicity as part of us, right? But we're all striving to improve, you know, and that's where I'm coming from.
All right. So Mr. Lieberman, we'll get to you in a moment. I actually am going to throw in a question, and so I get to use you. I'm the one person in the room that gets to use you. Basically, I'm special. And so, Mr. Saltwick, some people would say that the people in the best position to know whether we're still a racist nation are people of color. It would seem to be the case, again, according to a perspective, that in the same way that, like, is America a wealthy nation or a poor nation? Well, actually, I don't know if that comparison quite holds. In any case, my question is basically, do you think that, who do you think is best able to answer this question? Is it the people who would be experiencing the phenomenon in a negative way, or is it all of us?
So if the question, Madam Chair, is America a racist nation, then the question devolves to, who is America? And America is all of us. So I am sure that there are many people in America that experience racist things on a frequent basis. I mean, I've experienced racist things, not in America, but in Japan, when a businessman refused to sit next to me on an airplane because I was Ganjin, a foreign devil and all that, right? So I think each of us has to deal with our own life, but as a nation, and as the only way I can attest from what I've seen and the impact of my children and the discussions I have, no, I mean, clearly at one point it was. When I was growing up, it was. Before then, it was. I do not hold that it is now, and that's from my experience. And I think,
great.
And I think to your question, I think each of us, and I think we can build on common ground for that, right? I mean, one voice shouldn't answer that question. All of us can't, but I think many of us could form common ground on that question.
Okay. And so for our final question, we will go to Randy Lieberman. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Yes, thank you, Braver Angels, for putting on these events. And I'll get right to my questions. And in fact, there were two of them, but they're related.
You only get to ask one, unfortunately, but go ahead.
All right, I'll try to meld them together. All right. Do any of the speakers have an opinion on reparations? And can you articulate what reparations may look like. And I'm confused with the term that's been bandied about, equity. And can you explain what it is? And does it have a relationship to redistribution of wealth? Thank you.
So, thank you. That sort of was two questions. So we'll at least go with the reparations one. And just to clarify for folks, the way that our debates are structured, you can only ask questions to the person who just spoke. So Mr. Saltwick, that's for you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I touched on that in my remarks about redlining. I mean, redlining was for an explicit government policy that discriminated against persons of color, especially Black Americans, where they couldn't get house loans or they were prevented from living where they are. It's the reason why the east side of Boston was traditionally Black and the west side of Boston was traditionally white. Here is a situation where there is a defined pool of people that were specifically affected by a government policy, where you could actually probably calculate economic impact to that, right? And that sets a basis for discussing, well, what should we do about that? I mean, and there's a variety of solutions to that. I mean, it could be cash payments. Other people talk about entrepreneurial zones or something. But I think a guiding principle of a well-defined set of people where government policies have explicitly created a racist environment with a measurable impact, that is a point of common ground. We can begin to have a discussion on it. Where from my perspective, I think it gets very difficult is when we try to address all historical wrongs in some grand design, because for example, my grandfather came from Norway in 1909, right? Had nothing to do with America before then. And, you know, is he to be taxed with the sins of the past? We have to get to a place where we can have a discussion with a common ground. And I think the guiding principles I talked about offer a foundation for that.
All right. And with that, Mr. Saltwick is thanked. Jazz hands for Mr. Saltwick. Yes, very good. All right. I am now looking for a speaker in the affirmative. Mr. Kulkarni, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The first thing I want to say is that for a lot of people, this isn't a debate about fact. It's a debate about whether they can love their country, their history, or their heritage. Saying something bad about America is like talking trash about somebody's family members. And for a lot of people, that just immediately sparks the back of their neck. And so let me just say that I absolutely believe you can love your country and even your heritage and still believe that it is racist, just as you can love your family or a family member if they are racist, which many of us have and do. And let me also say that you can love your history and your heritage. My family is mixed race, and one side of my family is full of prominent Confederates, but I still greatly value my heritage, complex as it is, even if those people would not have even been happy about the fact of my existence. So you can love your country and admit it's racist. And I want to argue to you that being more honest about your country and looking your country in the eye actually is a better form of love and one that can lead to the kind of America that you really want to believe in and that you kind of have been taught all along really was what it was supposed to be. Okay, having said that, I think that there can be no reasonable disagreement, and I don't think there has been on this panel, that America was a racist nation. Until roughly the late 1960s, it was done by law, it was done by mob violence, it was done by tens of millions of individual acts of differential treatment that most people didn't even pretend they thought were wrong. They thought they were a moral virtue. So anybody who says in the past it wasn't a racist nation, I just feel like that's an argument against all fact. So the question then is, well, sometime in the 50s, according to some, 60s, according to some, 70s, according to some, most of the big structural factors around law changed to become at least overtly race blind. And in some cases, such as in the case of affirmative action, there's these sort of modest efforts at amelioration. And I say modest because the impacts of them are quite modest. So did it all end in the 60s when we ended the Asian Exclusion Act, when we ended segregation, when we ended legal support for voter suppression, when we enforced some of the civil rights violations that were happening systematically throughout, especially the South, but all across the country. To me, this isn't an answered question. To me, ever since the 60s, as a country, we have been fighting about what our answer to this question will be. Will we be the racist nation that we were, or will we be a new nation where we all belong as Americans? And I think that the burden of proof is on those who say that everything is different now. I would certainly not disagree that things are massively different. Even when I grew up, and the kind of racism that I experienced growing up in the 80s and 90s in Texas was really different than the kind of experience that my younger brother and sister had even just a decade later in the same high schools, in the same communities. So you can see change over time. And certainly those massive legal structural changes were a huge step forward for this country. But in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, it's as if we assume that as soon as you stop stabbing a man, he will stop bleeding and his wound will heal instantly. But I don't think that wounds heal automatically or instantly. In fact, sometimes I believe they fester. Or to put it otherwise, if you have a family and you take one member or several members of the family and regularly beat them, you take their share of the family's property and give it to other members of the family, so some have twice as much and some have none. You force them to live in the worst part of the family home. You tell them that they are deficient or criminal or stupid, unwanted and unwelcome. Then one day you say, you know, this isn't healthy for our family. Maybe we should stop being so cruel. And then at the same time, you keep everything as it was when you stopped. Everyone keeps living where they were. Everyone who took something or had something taken is left with what they had at that point. If somebody was forced to live in the garage and somebody else was living in the master bedroom, they just stay living where they are. Is this a fair family? Is this a family that treats all the members of the family equally? Is this a just family? Because when we say, are we a racist nation, what does racism mean? I'll tell you what I believe racism means in the simplest terms. Racism is a system that sets some people by either actual blood or perception of blood to be perpetually and permanently better than and deserving of more than other people, and a system that enforces that, and some to be inferior and lesser and deserving of less. So is that family that I described one that you would call a fair family? I think the burden of proof is on those who think we've made it right, because I don't think we have. I'll take two examples, and I'd love it if questions brought that out further, because I think that my time is running low. The wealth gap. The black-white wealth gap in this country is somewhere between 13 to 1 to 20 to 1, depending on the source you account for. Did that magically go away in the 1960s? Was there a wealth gap before that? Obviously there was. Did it go away and then come right back because of cultural traits we associate with Black Americans? That would be foolish. But can anyone imagine what it would take to actually remedy that wealth gap? Or should we just live perpetually where white Americans will always have more of the country's wealth than Black Americans? I think that the other example is mass incarceration. You could say a lot about mass incarceration. You could say a lot of reasons, and I think it's really largely overdetermined. But if a country has a circumstance where one unsubsidized population is incarcerated at 5 times the rate, and it's not just African Americans, we should say that. For Hispanics and Indigenous Americans, is roughly twice the rate of white Americans. When Black and brown people are incarcerated at such higher rates, can we just look at that and say, well, that must be cultural differences. It has nothing to do with the conspicuous fact that those were the most mistreated people up until the very recent time. And by the way, the time when those policies of incarceration started and those incarceration rates skyrocketed was the exact point in time when we stopped doing the other forms of legal discrimination. That, to me, the burden of proof is on the negative in this argument. I wish I wasn't on this side of the debate, but I would really have to see something to make me believe that it has all gone away and we've made it right, because I don't think we have.
All right, jazz hands for our speaker in the negative. Yes. We'll start with a panelist question and then go to 2 attendee questions, which will be from Wayne Boatwright and Elisa Gagliano. So first, Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, does the speaker believe that in general, the ways we understand race as a concept and as a structure in the 2020s and 2010s is a useful way to understand race in earlier American history as well?
Okay, that's a big, complex question. So in short, there was a time when Irish people were not considered white. and then they became white. There was a time when certain Eastern European people or Southern European people were not considered white, and they became white. Jews became white. So has it been stable all along? No. But one thing that has been stable is that there has been a defined set of people who are excluded from that category of white. And frankly, it has largely tracked to the color of your skin or the degree of closeness you were to the greatest forms of abuse that this society meted out on 8 groups of people.
All right. And so for our first attendee question, we'll go to Mr. Boatwright. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, could you ask the presenter how much of the racism that he has so self-identified might be recharacterized as merely masking a growing class system in America based on a meritocracy, but still one based more on wealth and education than on race?
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Kulkarni.
I really appreciate Mr. Boatwright's question. And for what it's worth, there are some who see race and class as pitted against each other, and I see those as twin issues that must be addressed in this country. Neither one can be left alone without the other. But let me specifically say that as regards meritocracy, I'm a believer in some concepts of meritocracy, but the reality is most of society's resources are dished out through a competitive process. And this is why this argument about if you take everything that somebody has and then say, okay, now we'll stop taking, you don't set things right, because we know that these benefits compound. If you give one group of people all the wealth of another group of people and then say, now go out and have a competition, and one of them use that competition to give better schools to their kids, better housing, safer neighborhoods, and then they come out better on all the social indicators and say, now we win the social competition and we reap the rewards of the next generation, you've rigged the system against them. So unless we undo that or create some situation to make it so that those who have been robbed are no longer at the bottom of society, they will always lose in the quote unquote meritocracy. Or I shouldn't say always,
right.
There's always a chance for people, but in general, as a whole, we'll lose out.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to go next to Ms. Gagliano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Oh, that's all right. Madam Chair, the question I would ask Mr. Kulkarni, he did mention about how, one indication of a relationship being racist is that you necessarily see one group of people as being less than another. And I guess I'll mention that I'm from the state of New Mexico, and this past year I did have observed some sort of disturbing situations where I guess to the history of New Mexico, there were indigenous people, then there were Spanish people who then it was America after. And so I feel like some people are seeing in I apologize.
You're fine.
It seems like in some cases, people who are bent on anti-racism, instead of looking at the part that the USA has played, they instead would rather go back and look at Hispanics. And so I'm kind of curious about how he thinks that focusing on a certain, how Mr. Kulkarni would argue, or whether or not he would argue that focusing on a certain point of history instead of focusing on current, current discrepancies in, wealth gaps or any other, or for example, New Mexico in 2018 was the 50th state in public safety, and it's a.
I'm going to ask you to come to your question.
Right, excuse me, sorry. So my question for Mr. Kulkarni is, do you see, what would be the best way forward, do you think, for addressing, historical differences that may be presenting more differently, or regional differences that I'm very
Look
sorry.
like racial differences. That's fine. Yeah. And
Yeah, I think I understand the question. Yeah. So.
Go for it.
So first off, I just wanted to thank the lady for the question, because it focused on this question: what do we do about it? You know, so is focusing on history sort of counterproductive? And shall we instead say, you know, now there's a lot of different explanations, but what can we do to make it better? And I think that fundamentally, being forward-looking is helpful. But I also think that for me, so much of my life and my story is about heritage and where I come from, whether it's the Confederate side of my heritage or the immigrant Indian side of my heritage. And I think that as a people, as a country, it's impossible for us to move forward without some story that we tell ourselves about our history. And so I would like that story to feel honest to all of us. I don't want it to be a story of damnation, but I want it to be a story that's honest. And I think that a more honest story will also help us to not try and hide the ugly and hard parts of what it takes to move forward to something better together.
All right. And with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands once again for Mr. Kulkarni. Yes, very good. All right. So we're actually going to, what we'll do next, we'll move on to our next speech in a second. But before that, we're going to do a quick poll. And so if our poll manager, Mr. Carnice, would go ahead and launch the poll. There it goes. Everybody, you've got 1 minute to answer. $15 seconds left. 10 seconds. All right. Good. So as we can see, good. So panelists, this is partly to give feedback to you. And it seems like what's going well in this debate. So everything's going well enough. But what's going really well is the respect that y'all are showing one another, and also the truthfulness and honesty of the opinions you are sharing. What our attendees would like to see more of is energy and passion. So fortunately, I'm calling on Monica Guzman next, and you know, we know how that goes. Yeah, I'd like to invite all of you to go ahead and bring us your your chutzpah and your gusto, and then also personal experiences and sort of those explanations would be great. But overall, going well. Thank you so much. And we can go ahead and stop sharing. Excellent. Okay. And panelists, just so you know, you'll have to click on the X yourself. Good. So next, I'm looking for a speech in the negative from, as I just foreshadowed, Monica Guzman. Go ahead.
Hello, Madam Speaker. First off, I want to give kudos to the debate team for picking a topic for a debate that is not so much about policy or even action, but is all about story. That really drew me in immediately. And when we tend to think about story, sometimes we're dismissive of it. Oh, it's just about story. But story is the foundation under everything else. It's the most impactful kind of debate there can ultimately be, because on top of the stories we tell, we do the things. As a career-long journalist for 15 years, to me, this is not just about story. This is about headline. So I know a lot about headlines. I've written thousands of them. They need to be accurate. They need to represent a story, be able to deliver on what they promise. But to garner attention in a busy and crowded world, they also need to provoke. They need to make you feel. They need to implicate you when they can, and even accuse you so that you can't look away. When I look at the resolution, America is a racist nation, I'm looking at a headline. Now, the number one reason that you would want to make a headline is because you have a new story. When you've reported out new facts or elevated facts that were previously obscure. We have that There is no question. In the last year, 4 years, 10 years, we have reported news stories about the depth of impact that racism has had, going back 400 years, all the way. We understand now at a deeper level, and we are continuing to learn, how racism has impacted individuals and broader society in ways that reverberate, in ways that echo. And to me, of that, there's absolutely no doubt. At the heart of this debate for me, I see a deep concern, which has come up tonight from several speakers, about how seriously people are taking the story of racism as part of the American story. And nothing is more serious than putting a story at the core of who you are and placing it at the level of identity. That brings up some interesting questions. Chiefly, I think, for me, is to grapple with hard truths. Do we need to define ourselves by them? Another way you could ask that is to think about goals. What is the bigger goal here? Is it progress on this story of racism? Is it getting out of it, right? Or is it the undeniable embrace of its worst parts? Now, that's sort of an unfair question, because I know that one idea is that we can't have progress on our story if we don't make an undeniable embrace of its worst parts. But I would offer potentially the opposite. I think it is possible that when we define ourselves by the worst things we have done, we undermine our ability to rise above them. So I'm the mother of 2 kids, and I can tell you that if I want them to not misbehave, a really bad way to try to do that is to tell them, you're a bad kid. You're a bad kid. And I think that this works across society. You know, you can't expect someone to win if you call them a loser and you make them believe that that's really what they are. So I think ultimately this question is, are we good? Are we bad? Now, I'm going to undermine my own argument for fun, because we're really looking for truth here, aren't we? You bet. Because think of an Alcoholics Anonymous scene. I imagine America walking in to the circle of other nations, sitting down and saying, my name is America, and I am a racist nation. Hi, America. In this scenario, that story is only the beginning. That definition is just an initiation. There is a process of support, accompaniment, honesty, abundant humility, but above all, love. Let's build ourselves a discourse that receives transgressions, even deep societal historic ones, with love. And America as a racist nation can be part of a story of redemption. We must be brutally, brutally honest. I agree with Silas wholeheartedly on this. We must be brutally honest about the story of American racism to avoid making it longer and uglier. But if America is a racist nation is just our headline, I'm afraid it will do us no good.
All right, with that, I'm looking for questions. Y'all have gotten this jazz hands thing down. I love it. Okay. So as usual, we will start with a panelist question and then go to 2 attendee questions. The first one will be from John Allen. So panelist question from Mr. Kulkarni.
So first, I just have to thank Ms. Guzman, because that was that speech, it almost brought tears to my eyes, and honestly had me being like, maybe I should just get up and go get this guy's debate. I don't want that to be the headline. So thank you, Ms. Guzman. But I guess my question to Ms. Guzman would be, my question to Ms. Guzman would be, what does it mean to put that into practice? Because in my experience, when I'm debating someone around whether America is a racist nation or questions like that, the person on the other side is usually somebody trying to downplay the suffering of the people on the losing end of this, and the person on the other side is usually someone trying to upplay that, and that's the kind of the context we're in. So what would it mean to not make that the headline, but not pretend that the hard or ugly truths that have not been fixed are over and past.
Thank you, Mr. Kulkarni, thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. I think about how when we make issues part of our identity, we don't then defend against some claim on the issue, we defend ourselves. And I think that that's one of the consequences of having racism be placed at the heart of the American character, is people who love the American character feel they have to defend themselves. And so what I would suggest is that we try to separate those things so that people are not conflating a kind of self-defense or a defense of the goodness of a nation that they love with this need to downplay something that is being thrust at them as a reason why America is bad. So I think there's something around that we can work on. Now, all that said, as I mentioned, I do think that this part of the American story is every bit as serious as folks are saying it is. I think that the urgency, the desire to put it at the heart of the American identity is best understood as a desire to have it be taken as seriously as possible. So I would also ask if there's a way to separate those two things, that we can still work on taking this very seriously, but that maybe it doesn't have to be at the core of our identity in order for us to do so.
All right, so we will now take a question from John Allen. John, go ahead and ask your question, and it's in the chat for you, so go ahead.
I too agree with Mr. Kulkarni.
Can you speak up a little? We can't hear you.
I don't know what my problem is. I would
So
say he can't,
unfortunately, we can't hear you very well. So I think I'm going to go ahead and just read your question because it's a good one. So here is John Allen's question. It is, how do we define what it means to be racist? Before we can answer the question before us, we need to have a common definition, and I don't think we're there. I think our individual definitions of the term differ depending on our backgrounds. For example, I've come to learn because I'm a white man and I'm not anxiously engaged in fighting discrimination, I am a racist. What does the lady think should be the agreed upon definition of what it means to be a racist?
So there is that wonderful question, Mr. Allen. There is that presumption that we need to have an agreed upon consensus, everyone's aligned definition of something before we can make progress on it. And what I would say actually as a storyteller is that never happens. It never will. I don't think that there ever will be a single unanimous agreement about the definition of racism. And I think that the battle about racism and what to do with it is encoded in that word. It's reflected in every facet of the battle over what racism even means. We heard a question come up earlier tonight about, is it asymmetrical, right? Can a Black person be racist against a white person, seeing as there's all these historic power dynamics at play? And we're not even sure we can answer that very well. And there's certainly plenty of disagreement about that. So I think that tells you a lot. So I will not venture a definition of racism. I think that the meaning of it that is useful to me is very simply the things that concern Americans about how we treat each other that appear to be based on this construct we think of as race, this physical attribute that we think of as race. And that's about as specific as I can make it. And so under that umbrella, you fit a lot of concerns. And I tend to prefer definitions where I can see a lot of concerns, because I think if you define something very narrowly and then demand that everyone agree with you on that definition, you're never going to get there.
All right, and because those were excellent questions and excellent answers and a little longer, we are going to stop with two. So jazz hands, Ms. Guzman is thanked. All right, I am now looking for a speech in the affirmative. Mr. Mackenzie, go ahead, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And when I saw I'm following Monica, my heart sank. I can never if I could ever match her passion I'll do my best, but she teed up what I'm going to say very, very well, I think. Because for me, you know, the question is America a racist nation? My answer is yes. And the story is not finished. Our history reflects laws and policies that denied people the rights deemed inalienable on the basis of race. We struggle with who should be included in the phrase, we the people. The original Constitution counted Black slaves as only 3/5 of a person. The Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case said, quote, people of African descent are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and therefore cannot claim any of the rights and privileges that instrument provides. This same thinking continued after the failure of Reconstruction with the adoption of the Jim Crow laws. These laws and cultural norms clearly reflect racism based on prejudice, hostility, and beliefs that a person's skin color gave them abilities or qualities that distinguished some as superior and others as inferior. Some say we're beyond that. After all, we fought a civil war over the right to enslave people of any race. We adopted the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments to the Constitution outlawing slavery, assuring rights in the Constitution to all citizens, regardless of race, and the right to vote to all citizens. We passed landmark civil rights legislation designed to further assure these to all citizens, regardless of race, the rights found in the Constitution. Unfortunately, the past continues to influence our policymakers today. And as an example, in 2017, the North Carolina legislature adopted voting restrictions which were found to be designed with surgical precision to disenfranchise and deny voting rights to Black citizens of that state. Today, we're witnessing other states adopt legislation similarly targeting the methods of voting favored by minority populations. Now, while overt prejudice and hostility toward another race is now in our country generally culturally unacceptable, the legacy of discrimination, while less overt than in the past, continues to be real. And while the past continues to influence some currently in power, I do not agree with those who claim white racism is endemic, as Steve Saltwick mentioned, and often elevate what is wrong above all that is right in America. I agree with Steve in quoting Obama there. I do believe, however, that we can't ignore our struggling tribalism that limits who is included in we the people. As humans, one of our intrinsic capabilities for problem solving is an affinity to align ourselves in self-interested groups that compete against one another. Martin Luther King, preaching on the parable that teaches we should love our neighbors as ourselves, recognized that affinity, saying, one of the great tragedies of man's long trek along the highway of history has been limiting of the neighborly concern to tribe, race, class, or nation. The consequence of that insular approach is that one really does not mind what happens to people outside your group. It is this subtle, less obvious human tendency toward indifference to the plight of others that supports, in my view, racial injustice rather than overt racial hostility or prejudice. This racism ignores the call to love our neighbors as ourselves. Instead, we limit our neighborly concerns solely to our tribe, race, or class. So given this tendency, how do we as a nation move forward? Fortunately, we humans also have an inherent instinct for solidarity. That instinct is recognized in our motto, E pluribus unum, one out of many. Just as we're wired to discriminate in favor of our self-interest, we are also wired to cooperate. And we've demonstrated this, as I previously mentioned, by adopting amendments and legislation that sought to assure equal access to our inalienable rights and provide more inclusivity to the phrase, "we the people." As a nation, we are continually testing our dedication to the proposition that all are created equal. Yet it is that ideal that binds us together and provides the cohesive sentiment that gives us solidarity of purpose. Lincoln called us to that ideal at Gettysburg. Martin Luther King called us to that ideal in Washington. Our founders pledged their lives, fortune, and sacred honor to defend the idea of human equality. Ever since then, Americans from all walks of life have sacrificed their fortunes, honor, and even their lives for that principle. For me, this is the American's identity. As Ronald Reagan said in his last speech, quote, "Anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American." It's that ideal of freedom and opportunity where all are equal and everything possible that draws us together.
All right.
And even though
I
we
ask you to wrap
struggle
up.
in the execution and have fallen short, it calls us to strive for the ideal as a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that we are all equal.
All right, jazz hands for Mr. Mackenzie. Yes, very good. So as usual, we'll start with a panelist question and then do 2 attendee questions. So let's start. I'll announce the panelist names, the attendee questioner names in a moment. Marie Segui is one of them. But first, panelists, any questions for Mr. Mackenzie? All right, maybe you just all agree with him. He is very persuasive. Mr. Kulkarni.
I'm just curious, Mr. Mackenzie rousingly describes the ideals of the United States. I'm just curious if he would judge a person more by their words or by their actions, and therefore, or what his assessment of the people who spoke those ideals was based on their actions rather than their words.
Madam Chair.
All right, you have 1 minute to answer. Go ahead.
Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kulkarni, for the question. Well, I always believe that integrity is matching your actions to your words. So if a person is of integrity, they would have to match their action to these words that are a part of our founding. And we have failed. There's no question that we have fallen short of that ideal, yet we continue to strive toward that in a way that is important. You know, we heard earlier about color blindness, and I think it was, again, Martin Luther King that was concerned about color blindness because in talking about indifference, he saw it as that common consensus of indifference that was the root of social injustice, and that it was important that we recognize if we have laws, if we have policies, or there are actions that actually impact a particular portion of the community adversely, in other words, impacting them so they cannot exercise the rights that are guaranteed to us, that's where we need to take action as a people. And we've done it in the past, we've demonstrated that. Yet we're still constantly challenged to do so. Thank you.
Absolutely. Marie Segui, go ahead. Unmute and ask your question to me. All right, Marie, one more chance to unmute. And okay, that seems to be having some trouble, so I'll go ahead and read your question. Marie's question is, there is racism everywhere in the world. How do you define a racist nation versus a nation with a minority of racist people? Go ahead, Mr. Mackenzie.
That's an interesting question, Madam Chair. I'm not sure I can. Is it only because there's a minority? No, I believe that at any time, if we engage in indifference toward actions toward a particular group, regardless of whether they're a minority or a majority, regardless of who the group is, if the actions we're taking adversely impact that group in a way that does not assure them the same rights that others have under our governmental structure, then I think that would be deemed to be racist in my view, because of how I'm defining racism here is an indifference to how our governmental actions impact a particular group of people.
All right, and for a final question, Ms. Slonim, Lania Slonim, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering.
It's in the chat if you need it.
Looking at a spectrum here of a racist past to a non-racist future, how will we know when we get there?
That's the $64 million question, isn't it? But I think we have the structure, as I mentioned, in our founding, that all are created equal, that they're equal before the law. And that as a result, in being equal before the law, everyone should be able to exercise the same rights and privileges that everyone else has who are citizens of this country. When we see persons being denied the access to those rights, that's where we must act as a people to say, no, that is not consistent with the identity that we all adhere to, the ideal that we've been called to numerous times from our founding.
All right, and with that, Mr. Mackenzie is thanked. Jazz hands for, oh yes, and you can do the jazz hands for yourself, Will Reilly style, totally. Good, all right, so for our final sort of initial speech, we're gonna go to Mr. Watson in the negative. Go ahead, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate it so much. And just since everyone did like a few minutes of introduction, I'll do like a very brief one. I'm Christian Watson. I'm the spokesperson for an organization called Colorists United. We're fighting for a race-blind society, and that's part of the reason why I'm very happy to be standing here and talking on all of you and not affirming the resolution today. When we think of America as a nation, I like to approach it from a scientific point of view. How would a scientist dissect the word nation in America? There is no scientist of any sort, any zoologist that would ever understand a lion or a hippo by understanding them through the lens of them being simple animals, them being a part of animalia. They would look at that particular lion or hippo and they would try to analyze their appendages. They would try to analyze things that are particular to them. Similarly, I think so many people reject what I call the principle of variations, which shows us that America is much more than can be sort of contained in a single word. Walt Whitman said in Song of Myself that we all contain multitudes, or at least that he contains multitudes. And I think the term America itself most certainly contains multitudes that I would say are divine. The same kind of America you get in Los Angeles is not the same kind of America you get in New York City. The same kind of America you get in New York City is not the same kind of America you get in Idaho. There are just so many differences in America. There are so many cultural, geographical differences that play into what it means to be an American, which is why, part of the reason why I have such a problem with the resolution, because it asks a simple question, a sort of singular dimension question about a multidimensional concept, which is America. But just because we are variated and just because we are different and pluralistic does not mean there's no commonality amongst us. Herein comes the American idea. The American idea is the fundamental proposition bequeathed through Locke from Hugo Grotius, going through the 17th century and coming out into the Constitution, that every single human being is created equal. Every single human being has inalienable natural rights. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard this before, and many of you and many people say or think, well, that may be true, but how was that treated at the time the Constitution was conceived? Only in America can you have a nation so complex that the person who penned the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, both seemingly allowed slavery to happen, but also himself married a slave. And then in his biographies, in his notes, called slavery an execrable, very bad institution. Only in America can you have a man like Frederick Douglass, who was born into nothing on a plantation, who comes up to be one of the greatest orators in the history of this country. Only in America can you have a colony of freedmen who were formerly in chains, 12 years later, go ahead and start the greatest testament to individual genius that was Greenwood Tulsa, and one of the shining examples of success at that point in time in history, only in America. And this is not just because these people were standing in spite of their struggles. This is because the American ideal is integrated into the fabric of our existence. The American ideal is not a political principle merely. It becomes a political principle through process. The American ideal is a natural principle that each and every one of us can tap into. And that natural principle stands above any singular event. And that natural principle stands above any singular condition. That natural principle is something that transcends any power structure. That's why the King George, was a target in the American Revolution, because he thought that he had the cradle of value. He thought that he had the sort of zenith of authority. He thought that he had the right to determine these things for human beings. But we showed through reason, and then through the application of that reason, that was a fundamentally false idea. America, my friends, I would submit to you, can never be a racist nation, because the natural condition of human equality can never be racist. Can America, that natural condition of human equality, interact with racist actors? Oh, yes. Can it be besmirched by racist actors? Oh, yes. But the good thing about natural conditions is that no one can deprive you of them. The good thing about natural conditions is that no legislator can will them away. The good thing about natural conditions is that each and every one of us have access to them. So when I see people say that America is racist or America had a racist past, I see people who have lost sight of what the American ideal is, and have lost sight ultimately of what the American ideal means to existence in life. The American ideal is not some abstract principle. If it was some sort of abstract principle, you would never have had Frederick Douglass. You would never have had the Civil Rights Movement. You would never have had any of that. All of that are consequences of that fundamental natural principle. And so it is for that reason that I stand in firm rejection of the resolution. And I thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, wonderful. Jazz hands for Mr. Watson. Very good. Okay, so once again, we will go with a panelist question and then attendee questions. So first for a panelist, Mr. Ballew, got your hand right up there. Let's hear it. You're muted.
Madam Chair, I'm just celebrating all of the speakers, and if there were any lack of energy, Christian cleaned up for all of us.
Didn't he though?
He killed it.
I was just thinking that, yes.
He was on fire. So thank you for sharing that, Christian. And we know that you're a student of philosophy, and your representations on Locke's idea of the inalienable right of liberty, right? If you could talk a little bit about that concept and closing the gap between what is and what is ideal. Because I think that one of the things that every panelist prior to yourself has agreed to is that, hey, historically, there was a gap. So again, if you could just talk a little bit about how in your construct we close that gap. In his construct, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing about history is that we tend to reject, as I mentioned before, the principle of variation and see all of history on this single scale. So when we see Jim Crow, we don't see the people or the faces or the conditions, all of them, which went under Jim Crow. We simply see Black struggle, Black pain, Black failure. We don't see the thousands of Black people, the millions of Black people who actually beat back the system and thrived on the American ideal of natural equality and human reason in spite of those limitations. So I want us to understand that's what Locke was talking about. I think Locke was fundamentally talking about our nature as human beings. This is what he mentions. He talks about the state of nature, how in this sort of natural state of being, we all have these rights and we go into society to enshrine and protect them. So I think that Locke was actually talking about not just an ideal. He was describing a condition. He was describing the physiology of man's nature. when I say man, I'm not trying to exclude women. I'm just saying as a general term, man's nature. And that truth is enduring regardless of any condition that has happened. Now, that truth can be assaulted, it can be attacked, it can be ignored, it can be defamed, but you cannot stop that truth from existing any more than you can stop a man from breathing and keep him alive. It's just something that is ingrained in our nature. It's a fundamental principle of the universe, and it has always existed. It may not have always been observed, but it has always existed, and it will always exist. And that's why I think America is an enduring concept.
All right. So we will now go to attendee questions. We're going to start with a fellow named Steve. There are two Steves here. One of you had a question about Tulsa. Whichever one of you that is, please unmute and ask your question. Maybe there's a tech issue. I think just since there are multiple Steves, I'm just going to go ahead and read the question. So the question is for you, Mr. Watson, is why did the Tulsa massacre occur?
Because there were some demented souls with dark hearts who decided to go ahead and burn down the creations of people who were living peacefully because they were jealous, they were envious. If you look at Tulsa, almost all the residents were much richer than most of the other residents of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the entire state. Many of the residents had their own fleet of private airplanes. There was just a immense amount of success, and there were certain individuals who thought that success was not warranted. But I think that when we say Tulsa happened and it was perpetuated by white folks, because it was perpetuated by white folks, we kind of missed the point. It wasn't the fact that the poor people were white is not the issue. The fact that people were envious, jealous, and didn't recognize the equal rights of those Black people in that part of the city, that's the issue, and that is an affliction that is transracial and can impact all of us. That's the real story out of Tulsa, not that white supremacy reigned supreme at that point in time and destroyed Black excellence. No. It's that hatred in general, which is a human condition. It exists everywhere. Decided to go ahead and it unfortunately won in that particular moment.
All right. And for a final question, we're going to go to Ms. Amy. And forgive me, Amy, I'm forgetting your last name. But she's actually working the debate tonight. So Amy, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If the speaker would briefly assume that many opportunities in America require historical access, whether it be credit history of your parents and yourself to apply for FAFSA, inherited wealth to support yourself through college, the quality of your local schools and ensuring that you qualify for college, would a history of absence of access qualify as systemic racism? And if you would please elaborate as to why or why not.
How you phrased it, no. Absence of access in general, no, because I don't think access has anything necessarily to do with race. Now, I think there can be a case to be made that for a very, very long time, there were certain ethnicities that were shut out of particular parts of society, like universities, and that hurt them. But when people say that, I think that number one, historical context is very important. Again, the conditions in 1960, 1970, or even before then, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, are not the conditions of right now. There have been a deluge of programs that have helped Black Americans get into college, and I think they've actually kind of hurt more than helped. It's just affirmative action, and they have kind of sort of tried to address what they saw as inequality. But there's also one more important thing as well. There are so many different reasons as to why you mentioned credit, as to why certain populations in certain areas may have lower credit that may have nothing to do with race. So I think that again we have a tendency to see all disparities as coming out from a racist thing, coming out from a racist origin, and that's just not the case. I think that if you measure disparities by race, you will be able to try to convince yourself or convince others that it is racist. But I think those are two very different things. Measuring something by something and that something actually being that something are two very different things.
All right, and with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands for our final speaker of the night. Thank you. Good. Okay, so we are now going to move on to what I will call a lightning round of response speeches. They are 2 minutes. They will go in reverse order from the way that we've done them, and there will be no questions between them. So I would like to start with a response speech from Go ahead and raise your hand. From Mr. Mackenzie. Go ahead, 2 minutes. You're muted. Also, you don't have to use the whole 2 minutes if you don't want to, but we do need you to unmute. Bruce, we need you to unmute. There we go. All right.
Thank you. You know, tonight we've heard a lot about the American story and the importance of that story, both from the standpoint of the ideals that we aspire to, but then also how we've fallen short. You know, and I think it's very important, and I've heard Monica speak to this, Luke spoke to it, Steve Saltwick spoke to it, the importance that all of these people's stories are part of the American story, and that we have to be honest about this, that for many of these people, we fell far short of the ideal. And yet, instead of giving up, they joined together and said, we're going to bring those words in our founding documents to life. And their stories are all part of our unique American story, out of many one. Those stories deserve to be heard as they make us realize how we have fallen short of achieving the ideal. That promise that here we are all equal and entitled to those rights deemed inalienable, unlike any place else in the world. It's that ideal, that promise that makes these United States unique and to which we aspire.
All right, very good. And with that, Mr. Mackenzie is thanked. For the background noise. We will now go to a response speech, 2 minutes, from Mr. Watson. Go ahead.
Well, again, let me thank all of you for being here. Let me thank all of you for participating in this. I know as John Stuart Mill, you know, I can't say he's one of my favorite philosophers, but he is someone who I have a defined respect for. He said that the purpose of these discussions is to exchange falsehood for truth. Now that's a paraphrase. It's not exactly what he said, but you get the point. So I just really appreciate that. Look, one of the biggest mistakes that any of us can make is thinking that America is simply this idea in the abstract that we aspire to, the idea of it being an experiment. Are there things in the country that can get better and should get better? Sure. But I don't think the American ideal is anything to aspire to because we already possess it, because the American ideal is rooted in our fundamental dignity as human beings. Again, whether who sees it or not, these are truths that are embedded into us. So when we can begin to realize that, we begin to see the reasons as to why people believe America is getting better. We begin to see the reasons as to why people like, you know, Frederick Douglass and Madam C.J. Walker and all these people who were successful in eras when they were attacked by the state were able to do good. We begin to see the reasons as to why the civil rights movement succeeded, not because they were going against America, but because they were simply using the ideal of America to go forward and make sure that it's preserved. So when we talk about racism, we have to understand this is not an abstract, you know, idea that's up in space that we can hope for and aspire for. No. The American ideal is natural. It is integral to every single one of us. When we understand that, things that seem to be wrong with our nation, things that seem to be concerned with our nation, I think, become much more better defined and explainable because they're not based on subjective whims or mere experience. They are based on the science of ethics, which come directly from our being and is confirmed, again, by the truths established in our founding documents. So thank you all for a good debate. And I'm very grateful to be able to be a part of it.
All right, very good. With that, the speaker's thanked. Yes, y'all are doing jazz hands before I even asked for them. That's great. Okay. So our next speaker will be Mr. Kulkarni. Mr. Kulkarni, 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was asked for more personal stories. So I'll say my father came to this country as an immigrant in the late 1960s. After half a century of what was called the Asian Exclusion Act, a law banning any immigration from half of the planet, including the half that my father was from. In 1965, the country changed its laws and decided to let the best and the brightest from the continent of Asia have a shot at the American dream. My father came in this wave of immigrants to pursue his dream to be a novelist. He won an India-wide competition to become a Rotary Scholar and was awarded a scholarship to study American literature. And as a Rotary Scholar, he was invited to a ceremony where he got to shake hands with the President of the United States. He was expected to tour Rotary clubs around the country and give speeches about what he would do with his scholarship. Now, my father was a very dark-skinned, as many Southern Indians are. And when he went to a Rotary club in Mississippi, where he was the invited speaker, he entered the bathroom before giving his speech. A member of the club entered the bathroom and saw him. He grabbed him by the lapels, threw him against the wall. He's about to punch him and said, "What are you doing in this bathroom?" And then at that very moment, the organizer of the event walked to the bathroom and said, "Wait, wait, wait. He's the invited speaker." The guy brushes him off and says, "Excuse me, welcome to the Rotary Club." My father goes on to give his speech. So welcome to the Rotary Club and welcome to America. Both of these experiences were true for him simultaneously. The meritocracy, the chance to pursue a dream, to come to meet the President of the United States, and being assaulted in a bathroom for his skin color alone. And so I guess I want to close by saying, for me, I'm not here to tell you whether America's a racist nation. I'm here to ask you. America has both within it. It has it both from the beginning, it has it both now. And for me and for so many of the other people who call no other place home but this one, the question for us isn't whether we love America, but whether America will love us. And so, is America a racist nation? My fellow Americans, you tell me, but please don't tell me with your words, tell me with your actions.
With that, the speaker's thanked. Jazz hands, yes. All right, we will go next to Ms. Guzman. You have 2 minutes, go ahead.
We've heard a lot about ideals and stories. I was so riveted by Mr. Watson's comments. I know the concept of original sin, and Mr. Watson was almost talking about original good, that there's ideals in America, and we can sort of rest assured that those ideals, that we aspire to them almost instinctively and automatically, and we can look at our whole story through their lens, right? But I also see, Mr. Kulkarni's concerns, that if we are, that the concern being that if we are so in love with America and so confident that the ideals will keep us good, that we may lose our scrutiny, our ability to scrutinize our own actions. I also see so many wonderful nuances speakers have brought up about, hey, some of these gaps that are called racist, you change some other variables and they close kind of quick. Like, are we sure that everything comes down to racism? It's like, well, maybe not. Being a storyteller and someone in the media, I have learned the hard way that a lot of times what appears true is what happens to be on stage in the moment, and that a society having a conversation with itself only has so much room for so many conversations. So often it's what's on stage, but that doesn't mean that what's on stage isn't true and isn't valuable to talk about. Let's talk about it. It means that it can be easy to forget that there are nuances we're not looking at right now. I think one of the things I really come away with for myself is that there's a difference between what is meaningful and what is useful. So we can see the meaning in different interpretations of the American story and the question of loving America and whether America loves us. But there's also the question of the utility of those things. What do we do with our ideals? What do we do with the story we tell ourselves about race and racism? What does that call us? How does that implicate us? So I think, last point, as I think about the two sides perhaps on this, I become more curious about folks who appear to condemn America in order to confront racism, and folks who appear to deny racism in order to love America. And I want to separate the dependencies of those two things so that we can look more honestly at this part of our story.
With that, the speaker is thanked. Yes, jazz hands for sure. All right, Mr. Ballew, you're up. 2 minutes.
So happy to be here, and I'm going to echo what Monica just said. So many different wonderful nuances on the subject. What comes to mind, though, is a work done by a gentleman named Peter Singh. He wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline, and in it he talked about a concept of dynamic tension. And I think when we talk about America, one of the wonderful aspects of it is that we do have these high ideals, right? I would even argue that they're God-given, men attempting to understand God's working in the world. And as we look at these ideals, we say, okay, this is it. I mean, look, liberty is what you have. It's a gift given to you that no one can take from you, right? But the reality is often different than the ideal. That's a fact. Any person that says, I want to lose weight, I want to become financially responsible, there's often a goal or a gap. And I think part of the honesty that we're all called to undertake as American citizens is to have the courage to see both where we want to go and where we are now, and to think constructively about, okay, how do we close that gap? It's not one thing, it's many things, and it's not one group that's solely responsible for it. It's all of us, right? Looking and pulling the very best that we have to help all of us reach those high ideals that we cherish as Americans. Thank you.
All right, and with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands, yes, for sure. Next up is Mr. Saltwick. 2 minutes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I again express thanks for the dialogue we've had today with the speakers. I think it's been outstanding. I'm honored to be part of this group. In my talk, I mean, I talked a lot about transformations that I saw when I was young to today. And one thing I want to highlight about that is when I was young in Memphis, Tennessee in the 50s, right? I think there were people on my block that would have been proud to call themselves racist, right? That was a cool thing to be. And I can think of nothing worse today to call somebody as a racist. The change in that term has resulted from a tremendous amount of energy that has been invested by this country, you know, to make that progress. And as a conservative, my view towards America is that's the best use of our energy, is to take what is good today and then invest energy to make it incrementally better as we try to approach, but will never achieve, our aspirational goals. And the worst use of that energy is to continually compare ourselves to an aspiration we'll never get to and talk about how far away we're from it. And I'm convinced within America, with dialogue like this and other things that I see in my daily life, that we're getting better, right? And that the energy of the country is focused on incrementally getting better, and that's a good thing, in my opinion.
All right, with that, Mr. Saltwick is thanked. Thank you, sir. Jazz hands. All right, next up, second to last, penultimate speaker is Mr. Phillips. 2 minutes, go ahead.
So I think one of the interesting divides, probably the interesting divide in this room, might be, I would characterize it as whether race is a primary driving force in American life that checks and cancels other trends and other inequities, or whether other trends in American life are the things that drive things, and race is usually checked and canceled by them. And I think we saw here many different opinions and understandings of that dynamic. And frankly, I think they're all honest understandings of it. And I found myself learning things over the course of this that were helpful too. So I don't know, it's useful to bring these out. And I think one thing that is sticking with me through this is that I'm not sure, I think the ideals and the nature of American ideals existing and being widely held are the things that redeem us. I almost get the sense that a lot of the time when we have attained the great things like the abolition of slavery and the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the general advance of racial progress over time, it's almost been despite ourselves rather than because of anything we specifically strove for. And that's a discomforting notion in some ways. But I kind of, despite having a lot of philosophical disagreements with some of the things Christian was saying in his understanding of the nature of American identity, it almost gives me a little bit of hope. His faith that we live a self-interested and passionate kind of way of doing these things. Because that means that even if we can't come to agreements and come to broader consensuses about racial redemption, we might get it even despite ourselves. And that just gives me a little bit of extra hope.
Yeah.
All right, with that, the speaker's thanked.
Yeah.
Yes, jazz hands. All right, last but not least, thank you so much, Mr. Reilly. You're still muted. There we go. Yeah, 2 minutes, go for it.
Just click that up. So I loved listening to all the different presentations today, including the different personal individual stories. I myself am a numbers wonk. I love personal narratives, but my point was basically an empirical one. The United States has a bloody history. We can never forget that. But racial discrimination has been formally against the law for 57 years. Pro-minority affirmative action has been the law for 53 years. Most of the wealthiest groups in the country are racial and religious minorities, 8 out of 10. Most of the gaps we see between groups close if you adjust for very basic things like age and study time. And this point, in fact, is a response to many of the great points made by speakers who argued the affirmative today. As re Mr. Kulkarni's question of how anything but racism could explain the black-white wage gap, my question would be why there's no Asian white wealth gap, except maybe one in favor of Asians. As it turns out, if we're curious, much younger people in the South have much less money than much older people in the North. Whether or not you have a married 2-parent family is the biggest thing that predicts how much income and wealth you'll have in life. And all of this applies to incarceration as well. Asians are about a third as likely to go to jail as white people are. That includes the Indian and Chinese Americans who face terrible bigotry from time to time. In 2021, the main reason there are a lot of cops in my old Black and Irish neighborhood on the south side of Chicago isn't racism. So overall today, we still have to remedy the sins of the past. We all agree on this, no one in the panel is a bigot, but we may be the least racist country on earth, or in the top 3. Our flaws are universal, but our successes are unique, and that's why I argued as I did.
All right, and with that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands once again. And okay, so we're now moving to the final part of our debate this evening, which is a quick debrief. So the chat has just been enabled, and attendees, I would like you to put your answer to the following questions in the chat. And then panelists, I'll ask you all also. The 2 questions are, please chat it to all panelists and attendees so everybody can see what you say. And the questions are, what did you learn tonight and what did you enjoy? So go ahead and start chatting those in. And panelists, you can go ahead and raise your physical hand again when you have a thought on what you learned and what you enjoyed. Let's go with Mr. Watson. And you don't have to use the Madam Chair stuff, you can just say it.
Well, what I enjoyed is the camaraderie, to kind of use a term that I use often in my own stuff, the pensiveness of so many people here, willing to engage in deep thought about these issues, the very nice poetry from Russell. I felt like I was reading Emerson, because Emerson's one of my favorite thinkers, and he very much writes like that. So it's just wonderful stuff. What I learned is, look, there are a lot of different approaches to understanding race in America, and I understood that, but there are a lot of approaches that are also rooted in the nuance of personal experience. And I think that a lot of times, whether you agree with that or not, that is overlooked when we talk about, again, as I mentioned, these sort of general, broad ideas that don't capture the people who are not beneath, but who are enveloped and enmeshed and captured by these general and broad ideas. So I always like to just say, let's look at the people on the ground who may be experiencing this stuff. Let's look at the people on the ground in general. Let's measure their experiences, like Mr. Reilly has done with empiricism, rather than simply sticking up above the cloud, staying in the abstract, and then trying to dictate a conclusion from conditions that are detached from reality. That's what I learned personally, that there's a lot of room to do the latter.
Wonderful. Yes. And panelists, I encourage you all to keep an eye on the chat and everyone else. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Silas.
I guess the two things that I learned are, or I guess I'd say the thing I learned and the thing I enjoyed. The thing I learned is that me and Mr. Wilfred Reilly need to have a couple rounds on the wealth gap. I think we both have plenty to say about that matter, and I think that'd be really illuminating and more beyond the scope of this conversation. The thing that I enjoyed is I really enjoyed Ms. Guzman's framing of the power of narrative and the power of defining ourselves as an identity, and what it means to define our identity by our failings versus what's good about us. So I leave it as more of a question than an answer. So, but it's going to keep me thinking for a long time to come, and I really appreciate that.
Excellent. All right, and yes, next, Monica, I will just also, by way of introduction, note that you've just received a nomination for president in the chat box. Go ahead.
I can't be president, you guys. I was born in Mexico. Dang it.
There we go. All right, tell us.
So there goes that. I have made it a habit recently to take note whenever somebody says something that makes me think I never thought of it that way. So I just wanted to credit a couple of statements from that. One from Mr. Ballew saying that the country brands us Black for the love of money, and how that part of the ideal of America initially was you can own your resources, and that included people. That was just a really fascinating point. Mr. Reilly said, maybe the best way to help with historic oppression is to help the poor. And that was a really interesting turn in my brain of class is something we tend to not look at as closely as some other things. And it doesn't mean that it matters more than other things, but maybe we should look at it. Let's see. Also, Steve Saltwick, goodness, just that when you said that when on your block in the 50s, there might have been folks who were proud to call themselves racist, it really landed for me that, all the ways, I mean, for so many folks, particularly white folks and whatnot, racism is sort of something that happens to other people, but I hadn't thought about racism is also something that happened to people at another time, that older folks have experienced a society that was more racist, and what are we missing by not having experienced those things as well, in terms of the perspective of how far we've come, I think is really awesome. So there's many more, but I will leave it at that to cede some of my time to others.
All right, and we'll take one more, Mr. Saltwick. Okay, two, fine. You need to unmute though.
Sorry about that. What I learned is that Monica thinks I'm an older guy. And she'll pay for that. She will pay for that, right? But the thing I enjoyed or was struck with profoundly is the fact that this conversation happened. For the majority of my life, this would have never happened. And it would certainly never have happened in this way, right? And so that is what gives me hope that, no matter the perspective we all have on these things, which are quite different, it gives me real hope, fundamental hope, that we can get together in a group like this and discuss an emotionally charged topic like this and not wind up calling each other names or walking off the set or whatever it is. And that's a good thing. And that's a very good thing.
Absolutely. Thank you. You're getting some amens in the chat. I'll add mine.
It's about me being an old person. That's what the amen is.
It's not. Okay, Luke.
Oh yeah, it's just always helpful to see just how much I don't know, and to have some of it told me by people in good faith and everything. So I'm always happy to be on these.
Wonderful. The thing I'll say is, and then we will wrap up. I know it's late where some of you are. Is just that I have never been able to sort of, I was one of the advocates that we debate this topic on the debate team, because I have never known how to square America's racist history and her ideals, racist and the present and the ideals, and like all the spirit versus the reality, all of that. And I feel like I learned a lot, which is not to say that I can summarize it in a single sentence, but I really found this debate really illuminating. And so I'm very grateful to all of you panelists. I knew this would be good once I had talked to all of you, but yeah, it's wonderful. We're also getting some comments in the chat that this is the best debate some folks have seen. So another round of jazz hands for that. And yeah, and the couple final notes. The first is we have an evaluation form that we would love for you to fill out. The link to it will go in the chat. Second, there are a number of next steps you can take. So one of them is, if you're not a member of Braver Angels already, join us. We need you. I feel like Steve's comments about just the fact that this can happen, in some ways, there's not a lot more to say. This is the work that we do, is we take on hard questions and we take what's actually in people's guts, driving them to fight with each other, and we talk about it, and we do that every day. And so, and this will never work unless we have a sort of citizens army of folks who are fighting or at least swelling against some of the institutional forces of polarization. So please join us. It's, I think, $12 a year, like $1 a month at the cheapest form. And so if you would consider doing that, we'd be grateful. Another step you can take after this is to, if you liked tonight, we have these every 2 weeks, basically. So we have 2 debates coming up that are linked. One of them is with a very cool company called Intelligence Squared, which runs expert debates. And so they're running a debate on media. Specific resolution is the New York Times has lost its way on July 29th. And then we're doing a debate on a similar topic on American media the following Thursday on August 5th. And so that'll be the kind of debate where anybody in the room can raise their hand and give a speech. And the idea is watch what the experts say and then come tell us what you think. And that will the topic for that one, I think I can get this wording right. It's American media undermines free speech and fair elections. And so sign up for those, and you can do that on the website. We're also putting the links in the chat. And then 2 more additional steps you can take with Braver Angels. One of them, so a lot of folks find it most fun to engage on the local level. You can do this in person, right? Like you can actually meet other people in real life, increasingly so now that the pandemic is hopefully winding down. And so please consider joining your local alliance. And we're going to put a link in the chat that goes to a map of the US, and you can click on your state and email the red or blue person there, the state coordinator, and find out, how do you get involved right where you are and meet people in person. Steve Saltwick, by the way, is one of our leaders of the field. And so, you know, if you liked him, you will like the rest of it too. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we have a new workshop called Depolarizing Conversations on Race, about race. And we have we run these periodically. There's one on Saturday, and you can sign up for that on our website also. So if you liked this, that's a way to continue with the subject matter. So I know that was a lot of things, but basically, look, I love that people are putting like advertisements for their local chapters, which we call alliances, in the chat. That's great. Anyway, there are lots of things you can do, and you'll receive a follow-up email within a couple of hours, and it will have the links for these things as well. So just encourage you to, if you liked this, there's a lot more where that came from. So with that, I just want to thank everyone once again for being here tonight and for being part of this. I really do believe it's part of what can heal our country. And we will end with a song. And so just to say this again, all of our songs come from, we did a songwriting contest. It turns out that like one of the many ways that people want to give back and give to this cause is through music. And so one of our many attempts to change the country is we're trying to create another sort of 1960s style groundswell of music, this time around, bridging the divide. So Esther, you can go ahead and start that whenever it is ready.
It's not black It's not white. It's not wrong. It's not right. It's not red. It's not blue. It's just me and you. It's not rich. It's not poor. Somewhere in the middle is the open door. If our points of view don't quite see eye to eye, well, that's all the more reason why we need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity, the sum of every part. Need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. Resolutions in a revolution of the heart. We're living in a great divide. This fear of each other is our suicide. I believe love's gonna keep us alive, but only if we decide. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity, the sum of every part. Need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. Resolutions in a revolution of the heart. It's not just the conversation, it's the listening. It takes every voice feeling heard to let freedom ring. We can solve our future, heal our history, sting, step toward our common ground, spread our better age of wings. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity, the sum of every part. We need a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. Resolution is a revolution of the heart. Oh, we hold this truth to be self-evident. I have a dream, a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. We hold this truth to be self-evident. I have a dream, a United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity. We need it, we need it. A United States of humanity. We need it, we need it now. Resolutions in a revolution of resolutions in a revolution of revolutions in a revolution of the heart.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.